naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The Bataan Death March, a chapter in our America's military history about which many people are unfamiliar. It's a story of defeat and tragedy, but it's also a testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. Hello, I'm Gerald Schertz.
And I'm Chris Schertz. It's also the story of thousands of American soldiers, sailors, and Air Corps members who were surrendered to the Japanese forces in the early days of World War II.
For the Schertz family, the history of Bataan is particularly meaningful because my father, our kid's grandfather, Major Paul Schertz of the 200th Coast Artillery, New Mexico National Guard, was there. He was among those lost when the Hell ships, unmarked enemy ships carrying prisoners of war, were sunk by unknowing U.S. forces.
By passing on the history of Bataan to new generations, the legacy of these heroes lives on. You are about to meet veterans who survived this horrific ordeal and hear their stories. You will hear personal accounts of the Bataan Death March and of life as prisoners of war. Through their moving recollections, you will come to appreciate the courage, patriotism, and moral fiber of the soldiers who called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan.
In 1941, as tensions were building between the United States and Japan, thousands of American troops were sent to the Pacific to defend the islands of Luzon, Corregidor, and the harbor defense forts of the Philippines. Americans stationed in the Philippines came from all walks of life and entered service with few preconceived ideas of where they would serve or of the enemy.
My story starts out as a 18-year-old soldier, 6 feet, 6.5 inches tall. In fact, I had to squeeze down a bit to get in the Army. And shipped overseas without any shoes because there's no size 15 shoes in the Army inventory in April of 1941.
I was raised among some Japanese here in the valley. And the Japanese that I knew were fine people.
Shipped us to the Philippines on the Coolidge. We didn't know where we were going. We just knew that we were out on a cruise. And we got to Manila, about the last week of September of 1941. And from there, from Manila, that we would just put on the trucks and were gone over to Clark Field, where we put up our bivouac areas there.
On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. By the next day, there were further attacks to include the Philippines.
About 2 weeks before the 8th, somewhere in the latter part of November, they moved us out into positions around Clark Field. And we dug our guns in, and we never did go back to our barracks after that.
Attacked Pearl Harbor in the morning, around 8 o'clock in the morning, and they announced it on the radio that they had attacked Pearl Harbor, but we thought that was part of the training just to get us used to war in case there would be war. So we were just laughing and I don't think there'd be war, you know. So when we saw the planes coming over, you know, we thought they were American planes, and we saw that white cloud of Navy planes coming over, and we thought they were Navy planes, so we started waving at them, and they said, "Hi, now, Japs, you can attack us anytime," you know. So at that time, they start dropping these black things, you know, and thinking that they were leaflets, we started running towards where those black things were coming down, and we thought that the pilot was saying, well, here we are to help in this and that, so we started running towards where they were dropping those things, and there were bombs. After they started bursting, it sounded like when you pop popcorn, it goes
See.
boom, 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 all over. Golly, we went crazy. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know.
On the evening of the 7th, one of the guys out of our battery went into Angeles and brought back 2 or 3 bottles of rum or gin, whatever. So we had a drinking party on the evening of the 7th, and kind of woke up with hangovers on the 8th, and also to the bad news that the Japs had hit Hickam Field in Pearl Harbor.
The day that we were bombed, which was the same day as Pearl Harbor, only over there it was the 8th because of the international date line. I happened, myself and several others out of my battery were in at Fort Stotzenburg Hospital with a case of malaria.
Whoops.
So when we were listening to the radio there and listening to what was going on in Pearl Harbor, and then one of the guys came running into the ward there in the hospital and says, "Ah, dang," he says, "you know, you ought to see the Navy planes coming over." We went out and looked, and then we saw that red dot on the wings. I said, "Hell, that's not Navy at all." I said, "Unless they've changed insignias." And so they walked, those bombs just walked right down the runway where all of the B-17s were parked. In fact, the B-17s hadn't been parked more than a half hour till they came in, and they just destroyed all of them. And there was 2 or 3 P-40s that got off, and that was it.
Duty at Bataan and Corregidor was difficult. The soldiers were cut off from reinforcements. Rations were low, weapons were old, air power was virtually non-existent. Fatigue and sickness were constant companions.
At first it was all right, but we couldn't get any more than half rations. And after about a month or 2, they started cutting down on it. And they would, the quartermaster would send in some food for us. They would deliver it once, I think it was once a week. I remember we were getting caribou meat. Me being a cook,
The local.
to get it, yeah. And then they quit sending caribou, and they started issuing horse meat. They were slaughtering the cavalry, the Filipino cavalry. You know, they were cavalry. The horses were real small horses, and that's what we used to get. But we wouldn't get it once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks.
How was that food enough to subsist on and drive on with, or was it?
Never was enough.
After nearly 3 months of combat, Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. Corregidor followed a month later. The troops were surrendered to the Japanese.
You know, the night of the surrender, the captain got us all together, and when we got all together, he gave each one of us a white little pill, you know, and I thought that he was trying to kill us, you know, and instead of surrendering, that he wanted to kill us. So I tasted that little pill and I just threw it away. So after a while, he asked everybody, "Had everybody taken the pill?" They said yes. So I guess that was like a tranquilizer or something, just to settle us down. And then he told us that he had bad news, that we had been surrendered, but I didn't take my pill, you know. So that's what he told us. He said, "Yeah, right now," he said, "you're on your own. You can either take off to the mountains, you can surrender." He said, "But I recommend that if you decide to surrender," he said, "surrender in groups. You have a better chance of surviving if you surrender in groups."
So we had group discussions then as to what we were going to do, whether we were going to try to go up into the mountains and tough it out up there, or whether we were going to surrender or what we were going to do. And our officers, bless them, did not place any pressure on us to do anything. We were kind of on our own because they didn't know any more than we did. We didn't know any more than they did.
The capturing, of course, is we were surrendered. We weren't captured. We were surrendered, and it's very important. And when they came down, I was on a second provisional company of infantry for the defense of Corregidor. The Marines had already been wiped out, and they scrounged up one company and thrown them in. Now I'm on the second company ready to go out, and they says the white flag has gone up. And so I became a prisoner of the Japanese. And the feeling you have when you become a prisoner is pretty mixed. For one thing, you fear for your life. You absolutely are scared. I wasn't scared stiff, but I was scared of what happened to me. And you're in a group like this. There's a number of hundreds there that's outside the Melinda Tunnel. And one of the things is that these troops that we initially had were not too bad. The first word you learn is to go ask to go to the bathroom, and then to bow when you do that. And once you got that in, you're well on the way to learning the Japanese language. The Japanese insisted to Wainwright, General Wainwright, that everybody in the Philippines would be surrendered, not just those that they'd actually captured. And one afternoon, still light, the Japanese put down a rolling artillery barrage that came within 100 yards of us. And I guess the threat was that unless Wainwright surrendered the whole Philippine Islands, a rolling barrage would come in on this prison pen and kill 12,000 people. And for the first time, we really saw the brutality.
What followed was one of the most infamous chapters of the war, the Bataan Death March. For days, the weakened and tortured prisoners were marched through the jungle to the Japanese prisoner of war camp at Camp O'Donnell. Many did not survive.
With the Death March was the beginning of brutality for brutality's sake. And there was absolutely no excuse for it. We had been down quarter rations for the last month. We had no ammunition, and the Japanese, with their bayonets and their rifle butts, killed many, many, many of us.
They just put us in line, you know, and searched us because some of the prisoners, prisoners then, they had Japanese souvenirs. And if they catch you with a Japanese souvenir, but none of our fellows knew that, if they catch you with a Japanese souvenir, they'd shoot you right away. They kill Captain Melendres and some other, you know, for having Japanese money or gold teeth.
If they fell, you knew if you fell out, they were going to kill you. That's just what they were doing. And no matter, you'd feel so tired, you think you couldn't take another step, and you'd hear them shooting people back there. You just have the strength to go on. That's all there was to it. And people did try to help some of the people. One afternoon, I and another man tried to help a guy that was kind of staggering along, and we thought we'd help him. And I got on one side, and he got on the other side. Well, we were all fighting for our lives. And we didn't have him just a little bit, and he just started begging us to let him down. So then we were really in a quandary then, because do you just put him down? You know you're putting him down to his death. And if you drag him, are you going to live? Anyway, we got him through the rest of the day. But that's what happened to you if you really tried to carry somebody else.
Up the road towards the beaches, and they were beaten. They were trying to reach over the sides with whips and sticks and everything else. And we would occasionally come to a halt while those troops were going by. And we went on in, well, couple of incidents occurred on that journey. During one of the stops, a Filipino kept trying to get on the back end of the truck that I was on, and a Japanese officer on a horse kicked him off a couple of times, and the Filipino tried again on the third time. This time the Jap just took his pistol out and shot him, which wasn't too pleasant an event for us. And then a Jap came up to the truck, and I don't know what he was doing, but anyhow, I was sitting on the end of near the tailgate, and he saw my wristwatch, and he wanted the wristwatch, so I peeled it off and gave it to him, and he gave me a San Miguel beer for it. Well, it was hot and muggy, and so I think that everybody on that truck got a swig of that beer, including General King.
We were then loaded onto boxcars, and a boxcar 3 times the length of this table, 24 feet long and 6 feet wide, should hold 80 men. It was absolutely ghastly. We could not stand up, we could not sit down, and for 4 or 5 hours we were like this while we went north to our first prison camp, which was Cabana de Juan.
As their internment wore on, some prisoners were moved to different camps.
And they had told us, you know, that if you surrender, they had to feed you, and they clothe you, and not force labor you. Well, I thought that, I said, if I surrender, I have a better chance. I said, because since we were in such bad shape, I thought they were going to put us in the hospital, you know. I could see white sheets and nurses with white uniforms and all that. Well, it was completely different. They threw us in this huge, big fence, you know. Nothing. The barracks were all torn, and we had to sleep on the ground. And oh, golly, it was a mess.
In the camps, prisoners still physically able were given work assignments.
We worked all the time. They didn't just leave us laying around in the camp. These were working camps, and we were taking the place of Japanese out there in the workforce.
3.5 years.
3.5 years?
Part of the time in the Philippines and part of the time in Japan working in the coal mine. And in the Philippines, we had to till about 200-300 acres of land with just pigmatic, like this, no plow, no nothing, no tractor, no nothing, just with pigmatics. And we had to till those 200-300 acres to plant vegetables, not for us, for the Japanese.
They asked for truck drivers. I was one of the first ones to go out. Says, "Is a truck driver help me one?" So there was a bunch of us that put us on one side, and then others for other things. And so when we got to this Batangas, Lipa, Batangas, when we got there, all truck drivers stand on this side, and the rest of them on this side. And we're looking around, we didn't see any trucks. There was a lot of wheelbarrows. They gave each one of us truck drivers a wheelbarrow. That's what they called truck drivers.
Another detail we had down at Command 1, number 3, and this was the worst one. Now those people, look at them. They are actually planting rice. And you can just think how, with my height, planting rice was an agony. And I straightened up once too much, once too often, and I got a bayonet in my ass.
We had a burial detail. We'd have the routine, the same routine, burying POWs every day. We'd take them to the cemetery. When it was in the cemetery, they would just dig trenches with bulldozer, as wide as the bulldozer plate would go. And that day, we would we'd go with the bodies, with the ones that died the day before, the night before. And we'd throw them in. The Japanese, they were always with us. They wouldn't let us go down there and place them. Some of them, you'd get them from their feet and other from their arms and just swing them and throw them in any way they'd fall. They come with the bulldozers and throw the dirt over them. The next day, it was monsoon season at the time, raining all the time. The next day that we go out there to bury others, these ones that we buried yesterday or day before, some of them would have their feet sticking out, their hands gnawed by wild animals, and the water that was on top, that would lay on top, was just as red as can be, blood.
And I was also chief anesthesiologist. And what my job was to sit on people who were going to have a limb taken off or anything painful. And I'd have my little piece of wood and keep it in his mouth and sit on his chest and as they were taking off his leg and whatnot.
Escape was strongly discouraged. The disobedience of one could lead to the death of many.
The man I went ashore with in Hawaii, he wandered off from detail. I don't know whether he was sick. I think he's probably just in a daze. He probably had malaria. Anyway, he just wandered off from the detail. So they decided he'd escaped, and when they found him, they just totally brutalized him, broke both his arms, both his legs, disemboweled him, gouged his eyeballs out, and then brought him back to camp for people to look at. And so they were very difficult with escape. Another man, from the first people I worked with at Hamilton Field, if one man escaped, they'd shoot 10 other people. So he was in a camp and one guy escaped. So they called up there and said they want 10 volunteers. So 10 volunteers went up there on the thing, and they talked a little bit, said, no, go on back. So they called numbers. And like I'm 1260, Sinyako Rokuju. So they just called 10 numbers, and the 10 numbers had to get up there. So those are the ones that were shot. And they just shot them because of 10 men, because one escaped.
After one escaped, the Japanese counted us, put us in groups of 10. And if one would escape, the rest of them would get it and kill the other 9. So it did happen once that one of them did escape, and the other 9 were sweating it out. Overnight, they caught him. The next day, they paraded him around the camp, but not the whole body, just the head on a pole, showing that he was caught.
Even as prisoners, there were efforts to sabotage the Japanese.
Well, I get the idea that we always felt we were fighting the Japanese, and that there was always that hostility, and that you never, you felt anything that you did that made it difficult for them was fair game.
We did sabotage anything we had, we could at any time. Their trucks, we used to throw sand in their gas tanks.
And it was more by accident than anything, but like I say, with the coal mine where we filled the walls with coal rather than the rocks we were supposed to. A lot of that was because the rocks weren't that easy. Coal was easier. But in other ways, in the mine I worked in under the ocean, when the pumps quit, the mine would fill up from the bottom of the water. So the B-29s came over and put the electricity out. So now the pumps didn't work. And so the mine starts filling up from the bottom. So they sent us down to the bottom floor of Muzinuki to try to save a lot of big electrical equipment down there. We broke ropes where we were supposed to try to drag these things out. And they brought rice balls down for the Japanese. They didn't bring us any. And the guys would get into their neck and waller around in that water and pretend like they was trying to pull on that thing, but they really wouldn't be pulling, you know. We just laughing because those big machines was going underwater.
Some endured movement to Korea, Manchuria, or Japan aboard stinking vessels, which came to be known as hell ships.
So they took us on a ship, they called them the hell ships. In that period, 8 months, from July of that year until January, 8,000 men died in ships on the way to Japan. And I went in July. And on my ship, I was on the ship for 62 days. We got 1 cup of water and 1 cup of rice. And that was it for everything, for washing, for drinking, and everything. So it was a pretty brutal trip. However, we had very little loss of life on our boat.
They took us from Cabanatuan to the docks and loaded us in 3 different ships. They get you to start walking in the hull of the ship where they transport coal. And they have you go walk in there until they couldn't load anymore. We were crowded in there. And it was very bad. It got real hot in there. There is where I've seen the brutality, the only brutality amongst us. There was one time when in the darkness, on one of them holds, you can just imagine how dark it'd be at night. There was one POW that was killed, and slit in the throat just to drink the blood. That was how thirsty we were. From then on, everybody slept back to back, guarding each other's back.
Unaware American prisoners of war were aboard, U.S. planes and submarines would ultimately sink many of these Japanese ships.
And we were, 4 or 5 miles offshore when a submarine sank the Shinyu Maru. In fact, it was a USS Paddle. I never found that out until this past September when I went on the reunion in San Antonio. Anyhow, a torpedo hit the rear of the ship, or the after part of the ship, and then one in the forward part. And I happened to be in a hammock there on a stanchion, and that cover just blew off and came back down and hit me, and that's when I got my leg all messed up. And we were all in the water. There were, most of them could swim, but there were only 83 of us that made it off that and got to shore. After I was out in the water for a while, then I could see the Japanese, I guess you'd call them motor launches, and they had machine guns, one on the front part of it and one on the back end of it, and they were shooting everybody that was in the water that they could see. And that's when I got under that hatch cover, that Vic Mapes, you know, that I showed you in that picture. Well, he and I got under there. And then one of the Japanese guards, now that was one of them we used to call Fish Face. And he saw us, and he was coughing up seawater and everything, but he was determined he was going to kill us because he was going to bayonet us. He caught me right here. I've got a hell of a nice little scar there. So we just held him under until he quit bubbling. Took his gun belt off because he had a canteen of water, and we drank the canteen of water between us and just let him go, and that was it. Now, that was September 7th, and 22 days later was the submarine that got us out of there.
The reason we got to Hong Kong is because there was 3 troop ships, two Japanese troop ships and 5 POW ships. And the Americans started torpedoing us. They got they got all three. They didn't know that there was a POW in them ships. They got. I understand that they got all three of the Japanese troop ships, and the other two American POWs, except ours. Ours wasn't damaged, and we ended up at Hong Kong.
When liberation came, most prisoners had spent more than 3 years in the camps.
We wrote, there was a lot of this white lye that they had there. There was a pile of it. It was white stuff, I'd say it was like. So we went and put a great big POW right in the middle of the compound. And then that's when one of the planes of the waves that were flying over went down and asked how many POWs in this camp. It says put one for each 100 in the middle of the compound, in the middle of the road, the compound there. And so there was 700 of us there. So, but to be sure that we'd get enough, we put 8 out there to say it was 800 of us. And then he had gone back and came back and asked and said, so through another bag of sand, and says, we'll be back with torpedo planes, and we'll be bringing you some food, medical, and clothes.
I flew a B-29 over the camp, and through the Bombay door, he opened up, the Bombay door opened and flew the American flag like this. Oh my God, we started hugging and crying at each other, you know. And I myself felt that the difference was that we were in hell. When we saw the American flag, that to me that was heaven.
Why did some prisoners survive the camps and others succumb? The answer varied from man to man.
The young fellows from homes which they'd never been away from, when they didn't have anything to hang on to, they died. And we called it bambooitis. And they could have anything you want, you could give them anything they want, they just died. And so the initial number of people who died in the prison camps were the young fellows, 18-year-old, 19, 20, 21.
The will to keep on going, because I don't know how dangerous it was. I still didn't think that I was going to die. Because when I was in that ship, I don't know if I told you already that they bombed us and they got a hold of that beam, that those fellows lost their mind, you know, they panicked and they started forming up a pyramid, you know, trying to get out of the hole that we were in. And I saw what was happening with the explosions. It felt like a vacuum, you know, wanting to pull you out of there. And with the flashes, you know, I could see the faces of all the fellows on the ground there, and everybody stepping on them. They were trying to form this pyramid to get out of there. So I got a hold of this beam on the side like that, and I just gave myself to God. I said, God, if it's your will for me to live, I'll live. If it's your will for me to die, I'll die. And I felt like nothing was happening. And thank God that helped me a lot.
I don't have a personal animosity towards them, but I want to remember what they did to me. I want to remember what they did to my friends. I want to remember what the situation was. And I don't.
Well, the men returned from prison camp and tried to resume the normal lives. They got married, had families, had successful careers. But many of them were not able to make the transition. and either committed suicide or drank themselves to death in the early years after World War II. It hasn't been until the last 2 decades that these men were able to sit down and relate their experiences such as you have heard today, even amongst themselves. The memories were just too terrible. The Bataan Death March, a tragic chapter in America's history, a poignant chapter that reminds us of the moral fiber and dedication of these men. But perhaps the most important lesson to be learned from this terrible military defeat is the hazards of not being prepared and not being ready. The battling bastards of Bataan. May their spirit live on.
Quedaron muertos y heridos, una gran numeración. Y había tantos heridos, era muy grande el total. Los llevaron del campo derechito al hospital. Pobrecitos los pilotos, lo siento de corazón. Quedaron toditos muertos en el lado de su avión. Los americanos son muy buenos al volar. Les cayeron de sorpresa, fallaron al levantar. Cumplimos los 4 meses el día 8 de abril. No pudimos ya pelear, nos tuvimos que rendir. Y ya cuando nos rendimos, ni me quisiera acordar que nos pusieron en filas y nos hicieron marchar. Marchamos de Maribeles hasta Mero San Fernando. Nos echaron en el tren hasta Mero Quempodano. Llegamos a Quempodano ya tarde como a las 2. Nos echaron en el cerco con guardias alrededor. Hay japoneses ingratos, ya no tienen compasión. Aquí nos tienen sufriendo en el campo de concentración. Nos resipala todo el santo día de Dios. No nos quieren dar comida más que un platito de arroz. Y ya con esta me despido con dolor de corazón. Y no más estar pensando en el campo de condensación. Si quieren saber quién soy, yo mi nombre